The wind in the high Arizona desert doesn't ask permission. It just takes. It took Sarah Dalton's husband, and it was now trying to take the last of her warmth. She pulled her shawl tight, stepping toward the woodpile as the sun bled out behind the mesas. That's when she heard it. Not the cry of a hawk or the whine of a coyote. It was a sound so small, the wind almost stole it, a thin human whimper. There, tucked in a hollow by the split juniper, was a package of frozen blankets. And inside, a shivering Navajo baby. That night she barred the door, and that night the tribe came. They didn't ride in, they just appeared surrounding her cabin in the dark and began to sing. The high desert of the Arizona Territory was a land of brutal truths. It taught you that life was fragile, that silence was heavy, and that you were in the vast, aching emptiness of pinon and sandstone, utterly alone. Sarah Dalton knew these truths in her bones. They were etched into the lines around her eyes, and the permanent chill in her hands. It had been a year since the rock slide took her husband Jacob, leaving her with a half-built cabin, a stubborn mule, and a grave marked by white stones. She was 28, but felt ancient. This evening the cold was a physical thing, a predator stalking the edges of the canyon. The sun was a smear of apricot and violet dying fast. "Need more wood," she whispered to herself, her voice a dry rustle. Her cabin, Jacob's defiant stand against the wilderness, was proving hard to keep. The fire was her only companion, and it was a hungry one. She pulled Jacob's old canvas coat tighter. It still smelled faintly of him, of pine sap and iron. She walked the 20 yards from her door to the woodpile, a messy stack of juniper and pine logs she'd split herself. The axe handle had given her calluses that had calluses. She bent to grab a log, and that's when she heard it. At first she mistook it for a kit fox, a thin, reedy cry, almost stolen by the wind that swept down from the Chuska Mountains. She froze her hand hovering over the wood. There it was again, a gasp, a whimper. It wasn't an animal. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Ambush. The word screamed in her mind. This was how it happened. A lure, a trap. She'd heard the stories from traders at Fort Defiance. She scanned the ridgeline. Nothing moved. The junipers were still. The shadows were deep and absolute. She backed away toward the cabin, her eyes darting. "Who's there?" she called out, and the wind snatched the words from her mouth. The cry came again, weaker this time, a sound of pure misery. Fair warred with something else, something she'd buried with Jacob and the small blue-skinned baby she'd held for only an hour. Conscience. She moved not toward the cabin, but toward the sound. It was coming from behind the woodpile in a shallow depression where a large juniper had been uprooted. Tucked against the frozen earth, wrapped in a blanket so stiff with ice it crackled, was a bundle. It was small, impossibly small. She knelt the rough denim of her trousers, scraping the gravel. With a trembling, gloved hand, she pulled back the coarse wool. A face no bigger than her fist stared up at her. Its skin was the color of rich copper, its lips blue with cold. A few strands of jet-black hair were matted to its scalp. It was a baby. Its eyes were squeezed shut, but as she touched its cheek, it let out one more ragged breath of a cry. "Oh, Lord," Sarah breathed. The words came out as a plume of white vapor. She looked around again, wildly. "Hello," she yelled. Your baby." Only the wind answered. They hadn't just left it. They had placed it. Here, by her wood pile, where they knew she would come. They were watching. She was certain of it, but the child was dying. She could see the frost forming on the blanket's edge, see the shallow, rattling tremor in its chest. She didn't have another second to think, to debate the why or the who. She scooped up the bundle. It weighed almost nothing. She ran, stumbling on the uneven ground, back to the cabin. She slammed the heavy oak door and dropped the bar. The solid thud echoed in the small room. For a moment, she just stood there, leaning against the door, gasping. The cabin was dim, lit only by the flickering orange of the hearth. She looked at the bundle in her arms. She carried it to the fire, unwrapping it on the bearskin rug Jacob had traded for. The outer blanket was Navajo. She could see that now, a tight weave of dark red and black. Inside, the baby was wrapped in strips of rabbit fur tied with sinew. Tucked into the furs was a single smooth turquoise bead on a leather thong. It was a boy. He was shivering violently, his small body contracting in spasms. "No, no, no," she whispered. She stripped off her own gloves and began to rub his limbs, her hands rough but desperate. "You're not dying here. Not you, too." She grabbed her own sewing basket and pulled out the flannel she'd been using to patch Jacob's shirt. She wrapped the baby in it tight and then held him against her own chest inside the canvas coat, sharing her body heat. She sat in the rocker, the one Jacob had built, and stared into the fire. The baby's shivering began to slow. He was still cold, but the immediate deadly chill was receding. She was a fool. This was a death sentence. Silas Croft, her nearest neighbor, 5 miles south, had warned her. "The Navajo are off the reservation. Mrs. Dalton," he'd said just last week, his eyes narrow in his sun-scorched face. "They're starving, and a starving man ain't sentimental. You're a woman alone. It's not safe." And here she was holding a Navajo baby, a stolen baby, an abandoned one, a Trojan horse. She didn't care. She felt the tiny sparrow-like heartbeat against her own ribs. She got up and found the can of tinned milk she'd been saving. She mixed it with warm boiled water, and a pinch of sugar dipped a clean strip of cotton in it and touched it to the baby's lips. He resisted at first, then, with a sudden desperate strength, he latched on, sucking the sweet warm milk from the rag. A tear traced a path through the grime on Sarah's cheek. She hadn't cried in months. She hadn't felt anything in months, just the dull ache of survival. Now this tiny breathing thing had broken through the ice. She fed him until he turned his head away, his belly full. His eyes, the color of wet obsidian, stared up at her, not with fear, but with a deep, ancient blankness. "What am I going to do with you?" she murmured. She named him in her head, Little Jacob. But she knew that wasn't right. This child was not a replacement. He was something else. A visitor, a test. The last of the light vanished. The world outside the cabin was plunged into a total star-pricked blackness. Sarah barred the window shutters, checked the load in her Winchester rifle, and placed it on the table within easy reach. She sat back in the rocker, the baby sleeping in her arms. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the rising howl of the wind. She must have dozed her chin on her chest when a new sound jerked her awake. It wasn't the wind. It was singing. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long, nervous shadows that danced on the log walls. The cabin was cold again. Sarah's neck was stiff. She'd slept for hours, the baby still nested in her arms. The singing was what woke her. It wasn't a song, as she knew it, not a hymn, not a saloon tune. It was a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. A low, rhythmic chant rising and falling in a cadence that vibrated through the soles of her boots. It was deep, guttural, and sung by many voices. Her blood turned to ice. They were here. She laid the baby in her empty flower crate, which she'd lined with her softest wool blanket. He stirred but didn't wake. She grabbed the Winchester. Her hands were shaking so badly, she fumbled with the loading lever, checking the chamber for the 5th time. Brass. Good. She crept to the wall, to the small peephole Jacob had drilled for hunting. She pressed her eye to the opening. The moon was high and cold, a sliver of bone, but it was bright enough. Her breath hitched. They weren't at the door. They were surrounding the cabin. She counted at least a dozen figures. They stood perhaps 30 yards out, just beyond the reach of her porch light, forming a wide, loose circle. Some were on horseback, motionless as statues. Others stood on the frozen ground. She saw the glint of the moon on a rifle barrel, but most were just standing, waiting, and singing. Hojo, Hojo, Hojo. The sound washed over the cabin. It wasn't a war cry. There were no whoops, no rattling. It was mournful, repetitive, and deeply, terribly sad. It was a sound of immense grief. "What do you want?" she whispered, her forehead pressed against the cold wood. She was trapped, a single woman with one rifle against how many she saw movement at the edge of the trees. More, maybe 20. A flash of anger cut through her fear. They left him. They left this child to freeze, and now they came to take him back, punish her for saving him. She moved to the front door, her rifle aimed at the center of the heavy oak. "Go away," she screamed. "He's safe. I'm armed." The singing didn't pause. It didn't change tempo. It was as if she hadn't spoken, as if she were a ghost in her own home. They weren't singing to her. She backed away from the door, her heart a trapped bird. She moved to the baby. He was awake. His black eyes were wide open. He was not crying. He was listening. As a particularly low, resonant bass note swelled from the chanters, the baby let out a small sigh, his body relaxing into the wool. This new realization hit Sarah harder than the fear. The song, it was for him. The terror didn't leave, but it shifted. This wasn't an attack. It was a vigil, a ceremony, and her cabin, her tiny, isolated fortress, was at the center of it. She sat on the floor, her back against the wall, the rifle across her knees. She watched the baby in the crate. The baby watched the ceiling as if the notes were visible, painting the air above him. The night dragged on, marked only by the repetitive hypnotic rhythm. Hojo, Hojo, Hojo. Sarah thought of her own stillborn son. She had sung to him, a single broken rendition of Rock of Ages. She had sung to a cold, silent nursery, to a husband too broken by grief to come in. She had sung her own song of mourning. She looked at the child in the crate. These people standing in the freezing dark, were they mourning him, or were they mourning for him? She didn't know which was worse. The hours passed. She fed the baby again. She added wood to the fire, the simple act a shocking noise against the backdrop of the chant. The singers never stopped. They had to be freezing. They had to be exhausted. Their dedication was terrifying. She must have drifted into a state of hypnotic exhaustion, because the sudden silence was as jarring as a gunshot. She scrambled to the peephole. The sun was just beginning to touch the eastern mesas, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and pale yellow. They were gone. Vanished. There was no sound of hoofbeats, no chatter. The clearing around her cabin was empty. It was as if they had been a dream, a mass hallucination, brought on by cold and fear. Sarah unbarred the door, the rifle held high, and stepped onto the porch. The air was so cold it burned her lungs. She was not mad. They were real. The snow, a light dusting from the night before, was trampled in a perfect circle around her cabin. Dozens of footprints from moccasins and unshod ponies. And on her doorstep, placed precisely in the center of the worn welcome mat, was a small, intricately carved piece of juniper wood. It was feathered on one end and painted with a stripe of blue clay. A prayer stick. She picked it up. It was smooth and still held the faint warmth of the hand that had left it. She looked out at the empty desert, the sleeping baby held against her chest. "My God," she whispered, "what is happening?" She didn't see the lone rider watching her from the ridge a mile to the south, but he saw her, and he saw the footprints, and he spurred his horse into a gallop. Sarah spent the morning in a haze of exhausted confusion. She fed the baby, who she'd decided to call Ash for now, from the Navajo word she'd heard traders use, ashki, meaning boy. It felt more right than Moses, more his. He was a strong baby. He drank the diluted milk eagerly and slept soundly, his face untroubled. She, on the other hand, was a wreck. Every gust of wind made her jump. Every shadow seemed to hold a man. The circle of tracks outside was a constant screaming reminder. They had been there. They could return at any second. The prayer stick sat on her mantle. It felt like a judgment, a claim. This child is ours. This house is marked. She was cleaning her rifle for the third time when she heard the horse. This was different. A single rider coming fast. The heavy shod hoofbeats of an American horse, not the lighter, faster gait of a Navajo pony. She grabbed the Winchester and stood by the door. "Who's there?" "It's just me." Mrs. Dalton Silas Croft saw some activity from my south ridge. "You all right in there?" Sarah felt a rush of relief, so strong her knees went weak. Silas. He was a hard man, uncouth and driven by profit, but he was a neighbor. He was white. He was in that moment familiar and safe. She unbarred the door. Silas Croft swung down from his big roan gelding. He was a tall, rangy man with a face like cured leather. He took off his hat, revealing a sweaty hairline. His eyes, the color of faded denim, missed nothing. He glanced at the rifle in her hands, then at the trampled snow. "Morning, Mrs. Dalton," he said, his voice a gravelly drawl. "Looks like you had a busy night." "Silas, thank God. Come in." He stomped the snow off his boots and entered, bringing the sharp smell of horse and cold leather with him. His eyes immediately went to the fire, and then to the flower crate beside it. "What in the blazes?" Ash, woken by the new voice, let out a small cry. Silas Croft stared at the baby. He didn't move for a long second. Then he looked at Sarah, and his face was not one of relief or sympathy. It was a mask of cold calculation. "You're a bigger fool than I thought, Sarah," he said, not unkindly, but as one stating a fact. They left him, Silas, by the woodpile. He was freezing to death. What was I supposed to do? "You were supposed to leave him," Croft said, flatly. "You're a soft-hearted woman from back east. You don't understand the rules out here. You don't touch their leavings. It's a trap, a test." It was a baby. She shot back, her fear turning to defensiveness. "It's an Indian," he corrected. "A Navajo. You know Keshgoli's band is off the res starving. They're watching you. They probably put it there to see if the cabin was empty or to get you to open your door. And then last night, I saw the torches from my ridge. Looked like a full-on powwow. They were singing. They didn't attack," Sarah said, her voice small. "They just sang. All night. Then they left." She pointed to the prayer stick. "They left that." Silas snorted a harsh, dismissive sound. "Medicine. They're putting a curse on you or on the baby. Who knows, it's savage superstition. Point is, you're in it now. You've touched their property." "He's not property, Silas. He's a child." Croft walked over and looked down at the baby. Ash stared back at him, unafraid. "It's a bargaining chip, Sarah. That's all. They want something. Food, rifles. You. Or they'll blame you." "Blame me for what?" "For stealing it," he exclaimed, frustrated. "They leave it, you take it. They come back. and say you stole it from their camp, they'll demand payment. Or they'll just take it, starting with your mule and your flour and ending with your scalp. He ran a hand over his face. Look, I came to help. You can't keep it here. What do you suggest? Give it to me, he said. I'll ride it over to Fort Defiance. The Army's got procedures for this. They'll send him to the Carlisle School back in Pennsylvania. Make a good Christian out of him. Civilize him. It's the best thing for him, and it's the only thing that's going to save your skin. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School. Sarah had heard of it. They cut their hair, took their names, and forbid them from speaking their own language. The idea sent a chill through her deeper than the Arizona night. No, she said. Croft's eyes narrowed. No, I'm not sending him to a school 1,000 miles away. He's just a baby. He's a liability, Sarah. This ain't a game. You're alone out here. Jacob's gone. You've got no one. The mention of Jacob's name felt like a slap. I'm not alone, she said, her grip tightening on the rifle stock, and I'm not giving him to you. A new, unpleasant look crossed Silas's face, a flicker of opportunism. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice losing its neighborly tone. You've gone soft in the head. Grieving's done something to you. When they come back, and they will come back, don't expect me to ride to the rescue. You're on your own, squaw woman. He put his hat back on, pulling it low. I'll tell you one thing. I know that old medicine man, Hastien Keshkoli. He's the one leading that band. He's a traditionalist, a hard-liner. He hates us. He hates the fort. If he's the one who left that baby, it's because it's sick. Or cursed. You've brought a plague into your house, Sarah Dalton. He turned and left, not bothering to close the door behind him. The cold wind rushed in, stirring the ashes in the hearth. Sarah slammed the door and barred it again. She was trembling, but not from fear, from rage. She looked at Ash. He had fallen asleep. Cursed, she whispered. She touched his cheek. He was warm. His breathing was even. He was perfect. He's wrong, she said to the silent cabin. He's wrong. But as the day wore on and the shadows began to stretch long and blue across the snow, a new dread settled in. Silas Croft was a dangerous man. But he knew this land. What if he was right? She looked at the prayer stick on the mantel. A blessing or a curse? That night she didn't wait for dark. She lit every lantern she had. She put a pot of coffee on the stove. She sat in the rocker, the baby in her lap, the Winchester on the table. And she waited. The wind picked up, and with it faintly at first, then growing stronger, came the sound. The singing. It had begun again. The singing was different this time. It was closer, more insistent. The voices were not just mourning. There was a sharp edge of demand, of impatience. The rhythm was faster, and it seemed to beat in time with Sarah's own frantic pulse. She sat for an hour, then 2. The sound was fraying her nerves, stripping them raw. The baby Ash was fussy. He wouldn't eat. He wouldn't sleep. He just squirmed his small face tight as he too listened to the sound. I can't, Sarah finally said aloud. We can't just sit here. She was trapped between 2 fears. On one side, Silas Croft, who saw the baby as a liability to be civilized. On the other, a circle of unseen singers who had left this child to die. But they hadn't left him to die. Not really. They left him where they knew she would come. The thought was a revelation. It wasn't random. It was a choice. They hadn't left him in the open desert. They had left him at her home. She made a decision. It was mad. It was the only thing she could do. She wrapped Ash in her warmest wool shawl bundled herself in Jacob's coat and picked up the Winchester. She moved to the table and, in a moment of what faith in sanity, she left the rifle behind. She picked up the prayer stick from the mantel. She unbarred the door. The wall of sound hit her. The singing was loud, coming from at least 20 throats. She stepped onto the porch, her boots crunching on the snow. The singing stopped. The silence was deafening. It was absolute. The wind itself seemed to be holding its breath. She stood in the pool of light from her porch lantern. "I have him," she called out, her voice shaking. "He is safe. He is warm." She held the baby up slightly, as if in offering. For a long moment, nothing. Then a figure detached itself from the shadows beneath the largest juniper. It was a woman. She was old, her face a road map of grief and time. Her hair was bound in the traditional Navajo tsiyel, and she was wrapped in a faded, beautiful blanket. She walked slowly her steps, hesitant, until she stood at the edge of the light. She just stared, her black eyes fixed on the baby. Then a man emerged from beside her. He was younger, tall and gaunt, with a face of stone. He wore a mix of Navajo clothes and cast-off army trousers. His eyes were hollowed-out pits of despair. The old woman spoke her voice, a low musical string of Diné Bizard, the Navajo language. The man watched Sarah. He was listening, not to the woman, but to Sarah's breathing. Finally he spoke his English, halting thick with the accent of the mission schools. "She asks if he fed." "Yes," Sarah said, clutching Ash tighter. "I fed him. Tinned milk and water. He's strong." The old woman spoke again, a long, weeping torrent of words. The man translated his own voice, breaking. "She is his grandmother. I am his father. My name is Natani." "His mother?" Sarah asked, dreading the answer. Natani looked away up at the cold stars. "She walked on 2 days ago. The child, he came, but she did not stay." Sarah's heart broke. She understood this. I'm so sorry. I lost my own." She couldn't finish. The grandmother, as Zomont Trosi, slim woman, stepped forward. She was weeping openly now, tears carving clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. She pointed at the baby, then at the cabin, then back at herself, and spoke. She thanks you," Natani translated, struggling. We did not leave him to die. We left him to live." "I don't understand," Sarah whispered. "Why not? Take him. Care for him." Natani's face hardened. This was the difficult part. "Our way," he said, "the Diné way. When a person dies in a hogan, that place is chindi." "Chindi, tainted," he said, spitting the word. The ghost, the bad air, everything that death touches. It is broken, unbalanced." He gestured to the dark, empty space behind him. "Her hogan, my wife's, we burned it, as is the way. Her things, they are gone. But the baby," Sarah felt a cold sickness rising. He lived. He wasn't touched by it. He was," Natani said, his voice raw. "He was in the hogan. He was born of it. He is chindi. By the old law, he cannot be touched. He cannot be part of the people. To care for him is to invite the sickness, to bring death to us all. Our elder, Hastin Keshgoli, he declared it." Sarah was horrified. "So you just abandoned him?" "No." Natani's voice was a whip crack. We defied the elder. We defied the chindi. He looked at his grandmother. Asdomo Tsosi spoke, her voice firm now. She says, Natani translated, that a mother's love is an older law. We could not leave him for the coyotes, but we could not keep him. We have watched you, the white woman, the Bilagayana. We saw your man, Jacob, be buried. We saw you, alone. We saw you leave food for the crows. We saw you grieve. We knew you were empty. You gave him to me. We gave him to a chance, Natani said. We placed him where you would find him. We prayed to the Dine, the holy people, that your emptiness would be stronger than your fear of us. And the singing, Sarah asked, her mind reeling. The song, he said, it is a hanee, a placing of the song. We were not singing to you. We were singing to bless the house, to protect the child, to keep the Chindi from following him. We were singing with you. Sarah looked at the old woman Azomotsosi, and for the first time she saw not a savage, not an enemy, but a grandmother shattered by grief who had made an impossible choice. He is Ashki, Natani said. He is my son. Before Sarah could respond, another sound cut through the night, the heavy sound of shod horses moving fast. A voice, sharp and angry, yelled from the darkness. See, Sarah, I told you, a full-on powwow. Don't you move, Pasha. A group of riders burst into the clearing. At the front, his face a mask of triumphant fury. In the lantern light was Silas Croft. He wasn't alone. He'd brought 3 of his ranch hands, and they all had their rifles drawn. The night air, already electric with ceremony and grief, now crackled with a new, ugly tension. Silas Croft and his 3 men, Jeb Hank, and a young, nervous-looking boy named Billy, fanned out their horses, snorting and stamping. They held their rifles leveled, not at Sarah, but at Natani and the old woman. Step away from her, Natani, Croft commanded. He knew his name. Of course he did. He knew all their names. Natani didn't budge. He and his grandmother, Azon Tsosi, stood like twin stones shielding the porch. This is not your affair, Croft, Natani said. His voice had lost its halting quality. It was cold and steady. It's my affair when a band of res jumpers are threatening a white woman, Croft snarled. It's my affair when you're on my range. This is not your range. Sarah spoke, her voice loud in the sudden quiet. It's my claim, and they are not threatening me. Croft looked at her, his face twisting in disbelief. Sarah, are you blind? They've got you mesmerized with their voodoo songs. They're here to take the baby, or to take you. They're here, Sarah said, because it's his baby. Croft laughed, a short barking sound. So, he left it to die. That's a forfeiture of claim in my book. We're taking the child, for its own protection. We'll bring it to the fort. No, Sarah said. That ain't a request, Mrs. Dalton. Croft gestured with his rifle to his man, Jeb. Jeb, get on the porch. Get the kid. Jeb, a big man with a tobacco-stained beard, dismounted. He started walking toward the porch, his rifle held loosely in one hand. Sorry, Mom. Boss's orders. Azon Tsosi let out a low, guttural moan and said something fierce in Dine. She says, You will not touch him. Natani translated his hand, moving to the hilt of a knife at his belt. Is that a threat? Croft said, raising his own rifle. You pull that knife, boy, and we'll put you in the ground next to your squaw. The cruelty of the remark hung in the air. Natani's face contorted in a silent snarl of pain and rage. This was the moment, the pivot point. Sarah saw the whole terrible future, spooling out gunfire, blood on the snow, the baby stolen, and her alone again, haunted by what she'd failed to do. She had lost her husband to the land. She had lost her child to God. She would not lose this one to Silas Croft. As Jeb reached the first step of the porch, Sarah made her choice. She stepped forward past Natani, past the grandmother. She stood at the very edge of the porch, the baby held tight to her chest. She was eye level with Jeb, who stopped confused. "You're not taking him, Jeb," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the cold. "Ma'am, please." I said no. "Get her out of the way," Croft yelled, impatient. Jeb reached for her arm. "Now, Mrs. Dalton." Sarah did not have her rifle. She had left it inside. But she had the prayer stick. In a move so fast it surprised even her, she swung her arm, the one holding the carved wood, and cracked it across Jeb's face. It wasn't a hard blow, but the shock of it, the defiant, unthinkable act, made the big man stumble back, his hand flying to his cheek. "Why you—" "Get back!" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking with a year of pent-up grief and fury. "That's it!" Croft roared, and he chambered around. "She's gone crazy! She sided with them!" He aimed his rifle, not at Natani, at Sarah. "Boss, no!" the young one. Billy shouted. "She's an Indian lover. She's as good as dead." The standoff was absolute. Croft with the power to kill, Sarah with the will to die. Natani and his grandmother, unarmed, about to watch another tragedy. And then from the rocks above them, a new voice called out. It was one word spoken in Dine, but the authority in it was universal. It stopped everyone. It stopped Croft's finger on the trigger. The singing, which had been silent, resumed. But it wasn't just Natani and the grandmother. It was all of them. The circle was closing. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, from behind the junipers and the boulders. 10, then 20, then more. They were warriors wrapped in blankets, some holding bows, others old rifles. They moved silently, forming a second wider circle around Croft and his men. Croft and his hands found themselves suddenly terribly outnumbered. At the head of the group, dismounting from a black and white pony, was an old man. He was tall, straight-backed, and his face was a portrait of ancient, unbending authority. His long silver hair was tied back, and he wore a simple buckskin shirt, but he commanded the night. Natani visibly stiffened. "Hastin Keshgoli," he whispered. The elder, the traditionalist, the man who had declared the baby Chindi in the first place. Silas Croft, trapped but opportunistic, actually smiled. "Well, well," he drawled, lowering his rifle slightly. "The chief's here. Looks like you're in trouble now, Natani. He's here for the cursed, baby. Go on, Keshgoli. Tell them. Tell this crazy white woman the baby is Chindi. Tell her to give it to me." Hastin Keshgoli ignored Croft. He walked past the armed ranch hands as if they were sagebrush. He walked past Sarah on the porch. He stopped directly in front of Natani and the old woman. And he began to speak. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the air sharp and angry. He was scolding them. Hastin Keshgoli spoke for a long time. His words were a rapid, percussive torrent of Dine Bizard. He gestured to Natani, to the grandmother, and then with a sharp, dismissive flick of his chin toward the baby in Sarah's arms. As Jomochosi, the grandmother, wept. She did not bow her head, but she answered him, her own voice full of a desperate, pleading strength. She pointed at the baby, and then at Sarah, and then at the sky. Natani stood silent, his face a mask of shame and defiance awaiting the judgment. Silas Croft watched this, his smile widening. "See Sarah," he said, his voice low and triumphant. "He's reading them the riot act. They broke the taboo. Now he's going to cleanse the sickness, and we're the ones who'll take it away. We're doing them a favor." Croft believed in his arrogant, pragmatic heart that the elder would see him as an ally, a tool to restore order. Hastin Keshgoli finished speaking to the grandmother. He turned his gaze on Natani. He spoke one sharp question. Natani answered his voice, low but firm. He looked at Sarah. He asks, why I defied him, why I brought this unbalance to the white woman's door. Natani then looked back at his elder. I told him, he said, his voice ringing with newfound courage. I told him my son deserved to live. I told him the chindi was a sickness of grief, not a sickness of the child. A murmur went through the assembled Navajo. This was a direct challenge to the elder's word. Keshgoli's face was impassive. He had seen generations born and die. He had seen the long walk. He had seen the white men come and take everything. He turned. He walked past Natani. He walked past his warriors. He walked until he stood directly in front of Silas Croft, who still sat on his horse, smug. Keshgoli looked up at him. The elder was old, but he seemed to tower over the mounted man. He spoke just a few words in clear, if heavily accented English. You speak of sickness, bilagana. Keshgoli said, his voice like gravel. You are the sickness. You come with iron, with lies, with schools that steal our children. You are disharmony. Croft's smile vanished. Now you listen to me, old man. No, Keshgoli said. It was not a request. It was a command that echoed with the power of the land itself. US. Listen. He turned and looked at Sarah on the porch. His eyes traveled from her defiant, terrified face down to the baby she clutched, and then to the prayer stick she still held in her white-knuckled hand. He saw the broken circle, the chindi, the grief, the defiance, and he saw the solution. He raised his hand and spoke his voice, carrying to all his own warriors and to Sarah's porch. Natani translated his voice, filled with a wondering awe. Astin Keshgoli, he says, the tradition is to keep balance. Hojo, he says, my wife is gone. The balance was broken. He says, this child was the unbalance. Sarah's heart sank. It was over. But, Natani continued, a tremor in his voice. He says, the spirits work in new ways. The child was left. The child was taken in. The Bilagana woman, she did not fear the chindi. She feared loss. She held him. She fed him. She blessed him with her own grief. Keshgoli looked at the ground, at the trampled circle of snow. He says, the hane, the song, was sung. It was sung to protect the child. But it also protected her. It blessed this cabin. He says, the chindi has been cleansed. The elder looked directly at Sarah. A flicker of something approval respect passed through his ancient eyes. He says, the white woman, she is part of the balance now. The child is hers. She is his shield. This was the ultimate judgment. The highest law in the canyon had just spoken. The cursed child was now sacred. The outcast woman was now a protector. Silas Croft was apoplectic. This had shattered his worldview. The savage hadn't acted like a savage. He had been outmaneuvered, outthought, and profoundly insulted. This is insane, Croft sputtered. It's madness. They're all savages. Jeb Hank. We're taking the childfire a warning shot. Jeb, his cheek stinging, hesitated. Boss. I said, do it. Jeb raised his rifle to the sky. Before he could pull the trigger, 3 things happened at once. Natani leaped from the porch, his knife in his hand. A dozen arrows were nocked on a dozen bows. The thwack of the sinew taut, all aimed at Croft and his men. And Sarah Dalton, who had not moved, who had not flinched, did one last thing. She walked down the steps into the snow and stood between the Navajo and the ranchers. She held the baby to one shoulder, and with her free hand, she pointed the feathered, blue-tipped prayer stick directly at Silas Croft's chest. You heard him. Silas, she said, her voice shaking but clear as a bell. He is my son. This is my land. And this is my family." She gestured to the circle of warriors. "Get off my land." Croft looked at her. He looked at the arrows. He looked at the grim, unblinking faces of Keshgoli's men. He looked at his own hands. Billy had already lowered his rifle. Hank was looking at the ground. Jeb was staring at the arrows. It was over. He was beaten, his face purple with rage contorted. He spat a wad of tobacco into the snow at Sarah's feet. "You'll regret this, Sarah Dalton," he whispered, his voice venomous. "You're the squaw woman of the canyon now. When winter truly comes, when they decide they're hungry, don't come crying to us. You've made your bed. You can die in it." He yanked his horse's head around, spraying snow. "Let's go, boys." Jeb, Hank, and Billy wheeled their horses, following him. In seconds they were just the sound of frantic hoofbeats fading into the darkness. Silence deep and profound settled back over the canyon. The sound of Croft's retreating horses was swallowed by the immense cold vacuum of the desert. The silence that fell back was profound, heavier than the snow, broken only by the stamp of a restless pony and the wind's low sigh through the pignol. The strength that had held Sarah Dalton upright, the fury, the adrenaline, the sheer maternal defiance drained out of her all at once. Her legs, which had been pillars of iron, turned to water. She sank to her knees in the trampled snow, a ragged sob tearing from her chest. It was a sound of terror, of relief, of a year's worth of unshed grief for Jacob, and for the child she'd never known. She pulled the baby Ash into the warm, dark cavern of her coat, shielding him from the cold, and finally completely broke. She wept not as a victim, but as a survivor. She wept for the wife who had walked on, for the father who had to give up his son for the grandmother, forced to watch this impossible, agonizing transaction. She felt a touch not on her shoulder, but on her hair. It was a hesitant, calloused hand. She looked up through her tears. The old woman, Astzomo Tjosi, was kneeling beside her in the snow. Her face was a landscape of sorrow, but her eyes were no longer weeping. They were deep, clear, and full of an ancient knowing strength. The grandmother put her arms around Sarah, and the baby, pulling them into a shared embrace. She began to hum a low, repetitive, minor key melody. It was not the Hane chant. It was not a song of ceremony. It was a lullaby, a sound that had passed from mother to child for 1,000 years. Here in the frozen darkness, surrounded by armed men, a Navajo grandmother and a white settler woman rocked a single child united in the universal language of loss and love. Natani stood over them, his knife still clutched in his hand. He was a sentinel, his head turning, watching the darkness where Croft had vanished. He was a father protecting his son even as he was in the act of giving him away. Hastin Keshgoli the elder watched the three figures on the ground. He watched them for a long, still moment. The new balance. A Navajo child, a white mother, a Diné grandmother. It was a strange, unprecedented shape, but it was, as he had decreed, Hoju. It was in harmony. He nodded once, a short, sharp affirmation. The judgment was complete. He turned and spoke his voice, carrying clearly to Natani, but his eyes were on Sarah. Hastin Keshgoli, he says, Natani translated his voice, rough with emotion, that the Bilagana Silas Croft is a man of broken earth. He sees only what he can take. He will bring trouble. But you are Kay. Kay, Sarah asked, looking up, her voice thick. Family, Natani said. The word seemed to hang in the air, a revolutionary concept. He says, you are not alone. We will watch the squaw woman of the canyon. He said the name Croft had used as a curse, but Natani said it with respect. Is under the protection of Hastin Keshgoli. Croft, will not be brave enough to challenge that. Not for long." The elder raised a hand, not in farewell but in acknowledgement. He mounted his pony. His warriors, who had been silent, witnesses a wall of arrows and shadow, began to move. They were not a war party. They were a community. They had come to witness a ceremony, and the ceremony was complete. One by one they turned their ponies, and like spirits, blended back into the canyons and the darkness. In less than a minute, they were gone. Only Natani and his grandmother remained. The air was thick with the unsaid. Natani finally sheathed his knife. He knelt, joining the two women in the snow. He looked at his son, his face a mixture of profound love and a grief so deep it was bottomless. He is your son," Natani said, the words costing him everything. My blood. But your shield. It is the way. He cannot be with us. The memory, the chindi, it's cleansed by your home, but it is not forgotten. The people would fear him. It is not their fault. It is the law." He reached out a finger and touched the baby's cheek. "But with you, he is new. He is safe from the past." "What is his name?" Sarah asked, her voice a whisper. "His true name. My wife. She did not have time to give one," Natani said, his gaze distant. "We just called him Ashki, boy." "Ashki," Sarah repeated. "I called him Ashki, Dalton." She said it aloud, testing the weight of it. Natani nodded slowly. "Ashki Dalton. A Dane name and a strong name. Jacob's name." He too remembered her husband. Astzomo Chosi. The grandmother pulled at the leather thong around her own neck. On it was a single perfect piece of turquoise. It was old, a deep spider-webbed blue, polished smooth by a lifetime of wear. She broke the thong and pressed the stone into Sarah's free hand. It was still warm from her skin. "She says, 'For the boy,'" Natani translated. "So the Diin Dine, the holy people, will know he is ours. So they will know he is protected. So he will remember the sky." I will treasure it," Sarah said, closing her fist around the stone. "He will wear it, I promise." The grandmother leaned in and kissed the baby's forehead. A final heart-breaking goodbye. Then, with a strength that belied her age, she stood, pulled her blanket tight, and walked to her horse without looking back. Natani was the last. He stood looking at Sarah. "We will bring meat. Soon," he said, not as a plea, but as a statement of fact. "Hides for the winter. The child will need. 'Kay, we provide." "You don't have to," Sarah said. "It is the way," he said simply. He locked eyes with her, a father to a mother. "Keep him safe from the Bilagana man. We will keep him safe from the ghosts." He turned and mounted his pony, a tall, gaunt shadow against the pale snow. He watched her for one more second, memorizing the image of his son in her arms, then vanished into the trees. Sarah was alone again, but everything was different. She stood up, her legs stronger now. She held Ashki Dalton tight. She walked back to her cabin. The door was still wide open, the fire inside, burning low, spilling a weak yellow light onto the snow. It was no longer the fortress she had hidden in. It was no longer Jacob's grave. It was for the first time in a year, a home. She stepped inside and barred the door. She was not locking the world out. She was locking her family in. She looked down at the sleeping baby in her arms, his face smooth and untroubled. He was not a replacement for what she had lost. He was something new, a bridge, a promise. The high desert was still a land of brutal truths. Life was still fragile. Silas Croft was still out there, and winter was coming. But the silence in the cabin was no longer heavy and dead. It was the silence of a nursery, the silence of a sleeping child. And she was in the vast, aching, dangerous beauty of the high desert, finally no longer alone. Sarah Dalton's story reminds us that family isn't always the one we are born into, but sometimes it's the one we are brave enough to fight for. In the unforgiving West, she and a grieving tribe found a new balance, proving that understanding is a shelter stronger than any cabin, and courage can warm a heart colder than any desert night. This is the kind of true hidden history of the West we love to tell. If this story of bravery, loss, and the families we choose moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a powerful story, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more true life dramas from the frontier. Click that bell so you never miss a tale. Thank you for listening.